Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 275, The Jews of Spain. As I mentioned last week, we're going to press the pause button for a moment on our Galileo story and spend a few weeks walking through the history of the Inquisition. Sadly, while there has been a tremendous amount written about the Inquisition since the 15th century, not all of it is true. Frankly, much of it is not true. Separating fact from fiction is not easy either when it comes to the Inquisition, especially because most of the records pertaining to the Inquisition have been destroyed, often deliberately. Hence, historians have to make major inferences a lot of the time, and they're making those inferences from what is often not exactly mountains of evidence. Now, that being said, the Inquisition is an object of fascination, not just amongst historians and history buffs, but in society in general. The word Inquisition brings up images in our minds of intolerant black-robed men torturing people for their beliefs. To an extent, that is true, but it would be a gross overstatement to suggest that the Inquisition was like our Halloween version in all cases. Today, I want to get into the very foundations here. The origins of the Inquisition, part 1. A story that, in and of itself, is going to dispel a lot of the myths about the organization. It all begins in Spain. And I do want to note before we begin that I will be talking primarily over the next few episodes about the Spanish Inquisition. There was an Inquisition in Italy, as there was in many Catholic parts of Europe. But the bulk of the Inquisition that we think of when we hear the word operated in what we today call Spain. So, let's start there. In the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was very much on the fringes of Europe. It had always been that way. The Romans had ruled it for much of their empire. Then it was conquered, first by the Visigoths, then by the Arabs. All this activity gave the region the most international feel of anywhere in Europe at the time outside of Constantinople/Istanbul. You could see a glorious Gothic cathedral in Burgos, a medieval synagogue in Toledo, and of course, the great mosque of Cordoba. This much diversity would have been extreme for any medieval European. Hence, in the Middle Ages, the peninsula was very much a society of uneasy social coexistence. Different communities occupied different spaces and maintained distinct cultures. There had always been serious conflicts in medieval Spain at both the social and personal levels, between Christian villages and Muslim villages, between Christian and Jewish neighbors. But the existence of a multicultural framework produced an extraordinary degree of mutual respect. This degree of coexistence was a unique feature of peninsula society, perhaps repeated only if we look at Hungary in the Ottoman Empire. Communities lived side by side and shared many aspects of language, culture, food, and dress, consciously borrowing each other's outlook and ideas. Where cultural groups were a minority, they accepted fully that they were a persistent dark side to the picture. Their capacity to endure centuries of varying levels of repression and survive into even modern times was based on a long and studied past. Now, of course, we're talking about the age of the Reconquista. Still, the notion of the Crusade remained largely absent, and society was, relatively speaking, open. In fact, at the very height of the Reconquista, around 1315, a Catalan philosopher was able to write a dialogue, in Arabic no less, in which there were 3 characters, one Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew. And it was not censored. Political links between Christians and Muslims in this imperial period are exemplified by the most famous military hero of the time, El Cid. It means Sayyid, which means Lord in Arabic. Now celebrated in the poem of El Cid, written about 1140, the real name of our protagonist was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, a Castilian noble who, about 1081, transferred his services from the Christians to the Muslim ruler of Saragossa, and after several campaigns, ended his career as an independent ruler of the Muslim city of Valencia, which he captured in 1094. Despite his identification with Muslims and Islam, he came to be looked upon by Christians as the ideal warrior. In the later Reconquista, echoes of coexistence remained, but the reality of conflict grew increasingly aggressive. The Christians cultivated a myth of the apostle St. James Santiago, whose body was alleged to have been discovered at Compostela. But by the end of the 14th century, quote, it was no longer possible for Christians, Moors, Muslims, and Jews to live under the same roof because the Christian now felt himself strong enough to break down traditional custom of Spain, whereby the Christian population made war and tilled the soil, the Moor built the houses, and the Jew presided over the enterprise as a fiscal agent and skillful technician, end quote. This picture was not far from the truth. Certainly, Muslims tended to be peasants or menial urban laborers. Jews, for the most part, kept to big towns, and the Christian majority, while tolerating their religions, treated both with varying levels of disdain. Now, the Jews, at least initially during the Reconquista, were the least affected by religious tensions. They were numerically insignificant, especially in Castile. And, in fact, in Aragon, they lived separately in their own communities, so friction with Christians was kept to a minimum. This lack of friction belies the reality that Spain was not, as often as imagined, a society dominated exclusively by insane zealots. There were all kinds of beliefs in the peninsula, and a lot of back and forth between them. In fact, in late medieval times, there wasn't even a formal concept of heresy, not even amongst Christians. But of course, this doesn't imply that Spain was a society of convinced believers. In the mid-16th century, a passing friar lamented the ignorance and unbelief that he found throughout Castile. Quote, not only in small hamlets, but in villages and even in cities and populous towns, out of 300 residents, you will barely find 30 who know what an ordinary Christian is obliged to know, end quote. Religious practice among Christians was a free mixture of community traditions, superstitious folklore, and oftentimes very imprecise dogmatic beliefs. Nor was the Iberian Peninsula the land of a one-way street. Christians could and did convert to Islam when it served their purposes. Likewise, the Moorish kingdom of Granada had a small but tightly knit community of devoted Christians. In Granada, in the 1620s, one woman reflected, quote, the Muslim can be saved in his faith as can the Jew in his, end quote. Given what we think of when we imagine the Inquisition, this level of tolerance is shocking. But that just means oftentimes we need to readjust our mindset. Now, of course, all of this is going to change. And the catalyst for much of that change that moved Spain, using that term anachronistically here, from a tolerant society to a relatively intolerant one was the end of the Reconquista. It was the final conquest of the Kingdom of Granada by Isabella and Ferdinand. Now, to an extent, both monarchs wanted to use the Inquisition, as we will see, to eliminate the open, pluralist society that had been Spain before their union. They also wanted to use the Inquisition to stabilize their power. Though, as we will see, again, it would be a mistake to claim Ferdinand, who outlived his queen by a significant margin, only wanted to achieve secular goals through the Inquisition. Neither would it be accurate to argue that the Spanish crown 110% controlled the Inquisition. It did not. Sadly, what we can say for certain is that the Inquisition did serve to intensify existing conflict already present in the peninsula. Now, when we think about the Jewish population in Spain, we have to remember that Jews have been on the Iberian Peninsula at least since the 3rd century. In medieval Spain, they constituted the largest Jewish community in the world. Compared to Christians and Muslims, however, they were still in the minority by a lot. In the 13th century, they were very likely formed under just about 2% of Spain's population. Maybe 100,000 people, maybe. Many preferred to live in towns that, by our modern standards, were extremely small. And so the Jewish presence created, at least in Christian minds, a stereotype of rich town dwellers, when, in fact, many Jews, in fact, most Jews in Spain, lived in small villages, which were very typical of the medieval countryside. There they farmed, they bred sheep, they kept vineyards and orchards. In the towns, they often occupied professions which involved daily contact with Christians, as things like shopkeepers, grocers, dyers, weavers. Sometimes they made a profession of their own. In the town of Murica in 1407, there were 30 Jewish tailors. This regular contact with Christians was very typical of the medieval period. It enabled Christians, Jews, and Muslims of all Spaniards and all of different faiths to pursue their daily tasks together. All three of these groups worked together. Christian contractors built Jewish houses, and Jewish craftsmen worked for their Christian employers, with Muslim merchants providing the materials. Jewish advocates represented Gentile clients in the secular courts. Jewish brokers acted as intermediaries between Christian and Muslim principles. As a byproduct, such continuous daily contacts inevitably fostered tolerance and friendly relationships, despite the irritations kept alive in the name of religion. Christians could accept Jewish physicians without prejudice. In fact, there's a private contract from Aragon in 1406 that reads as follows. Quote, I, Miguel de Pertusa, make this contract with you, Isaac Abraham, son of Don Solomon, to treat his son of a head wound, and I promise that even if he dies, I shall satisfy and pay you the fee due. End quote. The exception to this contract is that Jews did not normally intermarry with Christians. And for the most part, the communities of Spain lived separate social existences, sometimes very separate. Yet, slowly but surely, this, which was simple otherness in the beginning, turned into much more of a hierarchy. From the 13th century onward, anti-Jewish legislation became common in Europe. In 1290, England expelled its Jewish population. France followed suit in 1306. In the mid-14th century, civil war in Castile gave rise to excesses against the Jewish community in many towns. Religious fanaticism stirred up in southern Spain in the 1370s and 1380s by various individuals lit the spark to this powder keg. In June of 1391, during a hot summer which was made worse by economic distress, urban mobs rioted, directing their anger against the privileged classes and against the Jews. In Seville, hundreds of Jews were murdered, and the Jewish quarter was destroyed. Within days in July and August, the fury spread across the peninsula. Those who were not murdered were compelled to accept baptism. In Valencia during July, some 250 were murdered. In Barcelona during August, about 400. The major Jewish quarters and communities of Spain in 1391 were all but wiped out. Royal authorities in both Castile and Aragon denounced these excesses and tried, at least in the major cities, to protect their Jewish population. A Jewish contemporary reported that in the crown of Aragon, quote, many of the governors of the cities and the ministers and nobles defended us, and many of our brethren took refuge in castles, where they provided us with food, end quote. In many places, it was not the mob, but the upper classes were the perpetrators. The city of Valencia blamed, quote, men both of the country and the town, knights and friars, nobles, end quote. Many unprotected Jews were forced to become Christians. And so it was this time that the conversos came into existence in a major way. A converso, or new Christian, was the term that was applied to one who had converted from Judaism or Islam. Their descendants were always referred to as conversos. Given the forced nature of the mass conversions of 1391, it was obvious that many of these could not be genuine Christians. At least in the Crown of Aragon, royal decrees made it plain that the forced conversions were simply unacceptable. Jews, if they wished and if they had been forced to convert, could return to their own religion. Such was the royal decree. But circumstances had changed, and in many places these conversos felt that it was safer to remain in their new religion. How quickly they would learn the falsity of that. But their adherence to Christianity was, within this context, I suppose, voluntary. It posed problems, as we will see, both for their former co-religionists as well as for the new Christians. The conversos were inevitably regarded with suspicion. Insulting terms were applied to them, the most common being marrano, a word that we don't really know the origin of today. The reality was, for these conversos, though no longer Jews in religion, they continued to suffer the rigors of anti-Semitism. Even when Spain was more of a pluralist society, Jews always suffered discrimination. Like any other unprivileged minority, they were excluded from most jobs and barred from serving in positions of authority, like town councils. Still, Spanish Jews played major roles in two key callings. Doctors were in short supply in medieval Spain, and Jews stepped in to meet the demand. In the Kingdom of Aragon, quote, there was not a noble or prelate in the land who did not keep a Jewish physician, end quote. Popular hostility to the Jews was based in some part on their financial activities. In specific times and places, their role could be important. In the 13th century, under Jaime I of Aragon, some bailiffs of royal revenues in the major cities were Jews. Henry II of Castile told the Cortes in 1367 that, quote, we farmed out the collection of revenue to the Jews because we found no others to bid for it, end quote. That being said, the number of Jewish tax officials was, in proportion to Christians, always extremely small. By the 15th century, they served in the lower grades of the fiscal system, as tax gatherers and then as treasurers. In the period 1440 to 1469, only 15% of the tax farmers serving in the Crown of Castile were Jews. The number of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula shrank dramatically after those ethnic massacres in 1391. In some cities, the Jewish population was totally eliminated. By the end of the 14th century, Jews were no longer part of the middle class in Spain. Now, interestingly, despite all the stereotypes, on the whole, Jewish persons in Spain were not moneylenders, and they were not rich. Only 0.33% of Castilian royal revenue in 1480 came from the payment of various Jewish communities, a dramatic reduction compared to a century earlier. From the end of the 14th century onward, Jews left Spanish cities and traveled to the countryside, where their relations with the local Christians was normal and peaceful. Yet, in some areas, Jews continued to flourish. On the eve of the general expulsion to be issued in 1492, which we'll talk about, in the town of Zamora, Jews still made up 20% of the population. This was the case in several of the larger towns in Castile, though it would not remain true for long. The reality was, efforts to force the physical separation of Jews and Christians on the Iberian Peninsula had been tried, but had never been successful. In 1412, the Kingdom of Castile passed legislation requiring segregation, but it was never enforced. Subsequent measures were no more successful. This, to an extent, might be because the numbers no longer required separation. The mass conversions following the violence of 1391 depleted many communities. By 1492, the number of Jews in the Kingdom of Aragon was down 75% from a century earlier. By 1492, there remained some Jewish communities scattered throughout the 200-odd municipalities in Spain, but they were a shadow of what they had once been. From the beginning of their reign in 1474, Ferdinand and Isabella determined to maintain between the Jews and Christians the same peace that they were trying to establish in the cities among their nobility. The monarchs were never personally anti-Semitic, at least not that we know. As early as 1468, Ferdinand had a Catalan, a Jew, as his physician, and both he and Isabella continued to employ Jewish doctors and financiers as some of their closest advisors. In both Aragon and Castile, they followed the policy of their predecessors, taking the Jews under their direct personal control on the same terms as other Christian and Muslim communities which were in royal jurisdictions. Isabella declared in 1477, quote, "All the Jews in my realm are mine and under my care and protection, and it belongs to me to defend and aid them and keep justice," end quote. Likewise, in 1479, she gave protection to a smaller Jewish community in Carceres. Given that the Jews were constantly on the defensive against powerful municipal interests, the interventions of the crown in local politics present an impressive picture of the monarchy protecting its Jewish population. For example, in 1475, the city of Bilbao was ordered to revoke commercial restrictions it had placed on the Jews in the town local to it. In 1480, the town of Olmedo was ordered to construct a gate in the wall of the Jewish quarter to give Jews access to the town square. The monarchs intervened repeatedly against municipalities that tried to eliminate the commercial activity of its Jewish population. Now, the position of the Jews, not intrinsically bad because they had some royal favor, was unfortunately badly affected by the conversos and the converso problem. The monarchs became firmly convinced that a separation of Jews from Christians was the most effective answer to the situation, and in 1480, they set in motion a body whose entire concern was with those who may reconvert to Judaism. And this body was the Inquisition. Now, though the Inquisition only had authority over Christians, the Jews quickly realized that they too were in the line of fire. The existence of the Inquisition forced Jews to revise their attitude towards the conversos. When the Great Conversions took place at the end of the 14th century, many Jews may have felt that these new Christians were still Jews in a practical sense. A century later, though, the perspective had changed. Jewish dignitaries, scholars, and leaders, not always under active persecution, voluntarily embraced the Catholic faith. And some converts, especially those who became clergy, ultimately transitioned into bitter persecutors of those Jews who remained. For example, the Jews of Burgos in 1392 complained that, quote, "the Jews who recently turned Christian oppress them and do them much harm," end quote. A visible gap opened up in some communities between Jews and ex-Jews. In the early 15th century, rabbis were still expressing the view that most of the conversos were unwilling converts. However, By mid-century, that view had changed. Now, those same rabbis took the view that most were what were called meshumadim, or renegades, real and voluntary Christians. When the Inquisition began, the rift between Jews and conversos was instantly apparent. On both sides of the aisle, individuals had scores to settle. Close relations between these two groups, especially in the countryside, concealed long-standing tensions. Jews were non-Christians and, at least initially, as I mentioned, exempt from the Inquisition's jurisdiction. Initially, the Inquisition was focused on conversos and determining whether their conversion was genuine. In 1491, in the town of Useles, for example, a dozen or more Jews spoke freely to the inquisitor about conversos they knew who were still observing Jewish customs. That being said, cooperation with the Inquisition was not a tactic that brought any benefits. From the 1460s, some church leaders had begun to advocate the separation of Jews from Christians. This policy, as adopted by the Inquisition, took the form of a partial expulsion of the Jews in order to minimize contact with conversos. At the end of 1482, a partial expulsion of the Jews of Andalusia was ordered. The exiles were free to go to other provinces of Spain. In January 1483, Jews were ordered to be expelled from the dioceses of Seville, Cordoba, and Cadiz. The crown, however, delayed implementation, and the Jewish population was not actually driven out of Seville until the summer of 1484. It is possible that the expulsions were in part motivated by fear of Jewish collaboration with the Muslim kingdom of Granada, which remained at this point, but then was under attack by Ferdinand's forces. Still, the role of the Inquisition in all of this was key. Now, some towns did carry out their own expulsions, but those were done under opposition from the crown. Though Ferdinand and Isabella did intervene multiple times to protect Jews in their realm, by 1492, they too had become convinced that Jews and Christians needed to separate. Local expulsions, piecemeal as they were, had not done the trick. So, in 1492, the Spanish monarchs decided to expel the Jews from Spain en masse. Sure, the Jewish population had been expelled from medieval kingdoms before. But in England and France, for example, they had been a tiny minority. In Spain, by contrast, Jews had lived for a long time as a significant part of society. We can even see that in some of the laws that were passed. In 1490, the Royal Council ruled that, quote, hereafter no Jew may turn Moor, end quote, or vice versa. Of course, since 1255, it had been illegal for a Christian to convert to Judaism or Islam. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella hesitated for a long time over the idea of this total expulsion, especially since it didn't seem to hold any upside for them, especially since they stood to lose significant revenue. But then in January of 1492, the Spanish monarchs completed the Reconquista, taking the Kingdom of Granada. This was the final straw. Inspired by what they assumed was divine favor, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Edict of Expulsion, giving the Jews of Castile and Aragon until the 31st of July of that year, 1492, to accept baptism or leave. The justification behind the decree was that the mere contact of Christians with Jews was hurting the former. How that was happening, well, the order did not say. When the news of the expulsion broke, a deputation of some of the leading Jewish people of Spain went to go see Ferdinand, the king. Their pleas failed, and at a second meeting they offered the king a large sum of money if he were to reconsider his decision. There's a story that one of the head of the Catholic Church heard the offer and burst into the monarch's presence, throwing 30 pieces of silver on the table and demanding to know what price Christ was again to be sold to the Jews. This is likely apocryphal. But at a third meeting, the Jewish leaders became convinced that Ferdinand was determined to go ahead. So in despair, they turned to the queen. Isabella, however, explained that the decision, which she firmly supported, came from Ferdinand, writing, quote, "The Lord has put this thing into the heart of the king," end quote. But the reality is, the proposal to expel the Jews came directly from the Inquisition. The king said so clearly in the text of the edict issued in Aragon, a ferocious document that was obviously drawn up by the inquisitors and reeks of virulent anti-Semitism not present in the same text issued in Castile, where the Inquisition had much less authority. Later on, the king confirmed the key role of the Inquisition in a letter that he sent to the principal nobles of the realm. The copy sent to the Count of Anrada the same day as the edict explains the circumstances as follows, quote, "The Holy Office of the Inquisition, seeing how some Christians are endangered by contact and communication with the Jews, has provided that the Jews be expelled from all our realms and territories, and has persuaded us to give our support and agreement to this, which we now do because of our debts and obligations to said Holy Office. And we do so despite the great harm to ourselves, seeking and preferring the salvation of souls above our own profit and that of individuals," end quote. Now, it is certainly possible that the Spanish monarchs believed mass conversion was more likely than mass emigration. Certainly, the decision was a shock to many tranquil Jewish communities, but in many Christian areas, folks were prepared for it. Stories of alleged Jewish atrocities had been circulating through the years, throughout these communities, though false, effectively paving the way for the expulsion decision. And many Jews, likewise, probably saw the decision coming. In Parma, Italy, the Duke expelled the Jews in 1488. Milan followed suit in 1490. The dominoes were falling. But in any event, if you were to actually read the edict closely, you would see it's not technically an anti-person edict. The Spanish crown was not trying to get rid of a group of people, per se. It was trying to eliminate a religion. And Spanish clergy worked quickly after the edict to try to convince as many Spanish Jews as possible to convert and remain. Ironically, the Inquisition, which instigated the edict, proved to be a problem here. Many Spanish Jews were afraid to become conversos. They believed this would simply make them targets for the Inquisition, which was true, and which they desperately wanted to avoid. Regardless as to the intent, the expulsion was a traumatic experience for the Iberian Peninsula, and one whose shadow is not easily forgotten. There are few reliable statistics for the expulsion. Some authors claim 170,000 families were targeted, others that 800,000 were forced to convert or leave. The latter number is clearly too high. However, if we look at tax records from Castile, and again, this is just Castile now, it's not Aragon, this gives us a number of close to 80,000. Could have been higher, of course, it could have been, but it's impossible for us to say that with any degree of certainty. Now, the sufferings of those forced into exile for the sake of religion are vividly detailed by those who lived through the experience. The richer Jews, out of charity, helped to pay the cost of the poor exiles, while the very poor managed to help themselves in no other way but accepting baptism. Many were unable to sell their possessions for gold or silver, for the export of these metals was forbidden. So they sold their houses and property for the most desperate substitutes. Quote, they went around asking for buyers and found none to buy. Some sold a house for an ass and a vineyard for a little cloth or linen, since they could not take away gold or silver. End quote. The ships that met them at the ports to take them to their new homes were overcrowded and often ill-managed. Once they had been put out to sea, storms drove them back, forcing hundreds to reconcile themselves to Spain and baptism. Others, not more fortunate, reached their destinations in North Africa, only to be murdered. Hundreds of others staggered back to Spain by every available route, preferring familiar sufferings to those of the open sea and road. According to one exile, quote, some traveled through the ocean, but God's hand was against them, and many were seized and sold as slaves, while many others drowned in the sea. Others were burned alive, as the ships on which they were sailing were engulfed by flames. In the end, all suffered, some by the sword, and some by captivity, and some by disease, until but a few remained of the many. End quote. Now, of course, without minimizing the horror of this experience, I do have to note, of course, only a portion of the Jewish Spaniards were affected by this. And there, of course, is several reasons for this. Aware that a choice of conversion was offered, a great many people took it. It was one that their people had endured throughout the ages, and there just seemed little reason not to accept the offer now. Chroniclers then and later lamented the rapidity with which their people went to be baptized. According to one, quote, many remained in Spain who had not the strength to emigrate and whose hearts were not filled with God, end quote. According to another, quote, in those terrible days, thousands and tens of thousands of Jews converted, end quote. The evidence suggests that possibly half of all the Spanish Jews preferred conversion to expulsion. The majority in Aragon, and possibly in Castile as well, entered the Christian fold. Many did go into exile even in Aragon. Possibly a third of Aragon's 9,000 Jews went to adjacent Christian lands, most to Navarre and Portugal. Despite a persistent tradition to the contrary, no Jews are known to have gone to Turkey in and around 1492. It is important to note that unlike the expulsions from England or France a century earlier, there was no real financial motivation behind the expulsion. By Ferdinand's own admission, he stood to lose money on the deal. Frankly, given the reduction in Spain's Jewish population after 1391, the impact on Spain of the 1492 expulsion is probably a lot less than has been traditionally thought. It would also be a mistake to claim that the crown's purpose in the expulsion was to achieve a unity of faith. The king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, were neither personally nor in their politics anti-Jewish, or at least, again, I should say, we have no evidence to conclude that. The two had always protected and favored Jews and conversos. They might be accused of a lot of things, but not of anti-Semitism. Nor were they, frankly, anti-Muslim. Ferdinand and Isabella made no move until several years later to disturb the faith of the enormous Muslim population of Spain, who, of course, in practical terms, because of their numbers, were a far graver danger than this tiny Jewish minority. Although the terms of the edict issued in Aragon were rabidly anti-Semitic, the warm return given to the returnees confirms that the expulsion was not motivated by racialism. The proportion of those who returned was high. They were, the evidence suggests, given back their jobs, given back their properties, given back their houses. Those who had converted were protected against popular anti-Semitism. In 1493, the monarchs chastised people in the dioceses of Cuenca and Osma not to call baptized Jews turncoats. The new converts and old conversos continued to function in the trades and professions in which Jews had previously distinguished themselves. The purely economic impact of the expulsion, thereby, was reduced. Contemporaries in Europe who heard of the expulsions reacted according to the information they received. Many congratulated the Spanish king and queen on their action. Because it coincided with the expulsions, a new sexual disease, syphilis, which was identified during those months in Italy, was dubbed by some, quote, the Jewish disease, end quote, which of course it wasn't. Many Christians in Spain, then and later, thought that the expulsion was wrong. According to one report, several Spanish officials chastised Ferdinand for banishing the Jews. Now, interestingly enough, the expulsion applied only to Spain, the territorial limits of Spain. Spain itself, as a kingdom and the monarchs of Spain, would go on to rule a large swath of Europe during the 16th century. But the terms of the edict didn't apply there, at least not initially. It wasn't until 1590 that Spain would prohibit Judaism in Milan, though Spain had ruled Milan almost since the edict was passed, a century earlier. Not until almost the year 1700 would the Spanish crown prohibit Judaism in any of its North African territories. This again contradicts the claim that this was some sort of a religious crusade. What Spain lost was neither wealth, for the Jews had not been rich, nor population, because few people left. Some later commentators writing at a time of economic difficulty imagined that the loss of wealth was the main consequence of 1492. But the Spaniards who reflected on such things felt that the real loss was the failure of the crown to protect its people. The crown turned its back on the plural society of the past, cut off an entire community that had been a historic part of this nation, and intensified the converso problem without solving it. And as we will see as we proceed with the Inquisition, that tension, that converso tension, that fuel that it gives to the Inquisition will be the main consequence of the decision in 1492 to expel the Jews. In the end, the Jews had finally been driven by force into the Christian fold. According to one man, quote, in this way was fulfilled the prophecy of David in the psalm, Iripi me, which says, Conventur ad vesperam infantem pendiarum ut canis et Kyrianum civitem, which is to say, they shall return at evening, and shall suffer hunger like dogs, and shall prowl around the city. Thus, days were converted at the last hour, and by forced, and after, and only after, great suffering. If you'd like more Western Civ content, feel free to check out the links in the show notes. You can see the link to the website there, as well as several different ways to get access to Western Civ 2.0, which is a fun recap of what we did before, but in greater detail and in much better audio quality. Both offer a 7-day free trial. Check it out if you are so inclined.